Hello, my name is Helen Margaret Rhodes. I'm 74 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and until recently, a mother everyone assumed would simply stay put. Last week, my son looked at me and said, "You're too old. Mom, stay home and watch the house." He didn't say it with anger. He said it like a favor, like a decision had already been made. And that's when I realized they had all stopped seeing me. So the next morning, I left without a word. Not because I was angry, but because I needed to remember who I was before they decided for me. I wasn't angry. That sentence didn't have any thorns, but it felt like someone had gently put me on the sidelines and then closed the door. The kitchen was full of morning sun, but still cool in the corners. I had opened the windows too early again. The warmth hadn't yet reached the floor tiles or the tips of my fingers. I wrapped a shawl tighter around my shoulders and watched Rachel stack sunscreen and travel mugs near the back door. She was tidy, deliberate. I didn't interrupt. Yesterday, I had taken out the good cake tin, the round one with the removable base, and baked a lemon poppy seed loaf. I sliced it, wrapped it in wax paper, and placed it gently into the woven picnic basket. I imagined them, the four of them, stopping along the coast and eating it under the redwoods. But Daniel hadn't touched it. "It'll be a tight fit in the trunk, Mum," he said, giving me a soft smile. "We're mostly doing restaurants anyway." I nodded quietly. I understood. I always understood. Abby had come down the stairs with earbuds in her backpack sagging on one shoulder. She waved at me distractedly. "Hey, Grandma." And then she was gone back upstairs again. Rachel glanced over at me. "You'd be more comfortable at home resting. The roads will be long." "You deserve a little quiet, Helen." They all said it kindly. There was no argument, no malice. Daniel looked up from his checklist and said it like it was a favor. "We need someone to look after the house, and you've always been good at that." I smiled. I don't remember whether I answered. Maybe I said, "Of course." Maybe I said nothing. The moment had already hardened like old paint, dry set, untouchable. That night, I opened the back closet and took out the blue suitcase I had used last winter when I'd briefly stayed with a friend in Spokane. Inside was a folded train ticket I never used, the ink slightly faded, but still legible, and my expired library card. I ran my fingers across the name printed on the back. Helen Margaret Rhodes. There was a time that name meant something. A teacher, a speaker at PTA meetings, the woman who organized spring book drives at Jefferson Elementary. Now it was mostly used to label my prescriptions and medical appointments. I packed light. My second best coat, 2 cardigans, walking shoes, a paperback that still smelled of rain, and one photograph of my younger self standing with Frank beside the old red Buick. At dawn, I walked the familiar hallways for the last time. I left a note on the fridge that simply read, "Gone for a while. Don't worry." The train into town was nearly empty. I sat by the window and watched the city pass by the early blue light, staining every surface with quiet. A couple across from me argued in hushed tones. The woman clutched a bouquet wrapped in newspaper. At the terminal, the sign above Gate 17 read, "Seattle, the beginning of farewells." I whispered aloud, though no one was listening. I was not left behind. I withdrew. I held the words in my chest, like an old song I had almost forgotten. The flight to Lisbon was long, but smooth. I didn't sleep, but I didn't fidget either. I simply existed in the space between what was known and what was next. When I landed, the air was warmer than I'd expected. The cab driver spoke in clipped English, and I replied in gestures and nods. It was easy to be anonymous. The city didn't ask who I was. It simply let me be. In my rented flat on the edge of Alfama, I turned on the kettle and opened the windows wide. I didn't need to unpack just yet. I placed my phone on the small wooden desk and switched it to airplane mode. Then I picked up my notebook and began to write. Day 1. I didn't say goodbye, but I left. Lisbon did not ask me to smile, nor did it ask me to explain why I went alone. I chose it, the way people choose to start without a reason. The apartment was small, but kind. The floors creaked like they had been holding people's secrets for decades, and the windows opened wide to a slice of river that shimmered in the morning. I boiled tea in a dented kettle, wrote short notes in my diary, and let time move without asking it to hurry. On day 3, I found the map. It was tucked inside a faded travel guide to Portugal, one I had slipped into the suitcase without noticing. A red pen had circled places: Sintra, Cascais, a narrow line drawn along the riverfront. It was David's handwriting, neat, slightly tilted to the right, always in red. He had once told me, if we ever go, let's never plan too tightly. Let's leave space for accidents. But we never went. There was always work, the school year, the children, his blood pressure, and then it became too late. I folded the map gently and put it back. Later that morning, I sat at a riverside cafe, the kind where they don't rush you to leave. The waiter, a young man with long lashes and a quick smile, spoke to me in Spanish at first. I corrected him softly. "Ah, English," he said, still cheerful. "You looked not lost, but not local either, like someone who forgot something." I laughed politely, but the words lingered. Nina introduced herself that afternoon in the hallway. Her door was 2 down from mine. She was American divorced, mid-60s, sharp cheekbones, and an expensive haircut that was outgrowing itself. "You new here too?" she asked, balancing a bag of oranges on one hip. "You don't look like a tourist. I'm just—" Pausing, I replied. She nodded like she understood something I hadn't said aloud. That night I wrote in my notebook, Day 3. My silence is no longer a defense. It's a space to observe. It was only after that, while checking my emails on the rickety table near the window, that I noticed the alert from my bank. Unusual login activity. Linked account accessed from an external IP. I blinked at the screen. I had only ever linked one account years ago after Frank died. The joint one in case Daniel needed to help with taxes or utilities while I was recovering from surgery. But I hadn't used that account since. It had only a small balance, a few auto deductions. I clicked through. The last login wasn't mine. I tried not to panic. It could be a mistake, a tech error. But the name listed under Account Manager Access made my chest tighten. Daniel Rhodes. I closed the laptop, breathed deeply, then opened it again. I called the bank. The woman on the line was courteous, but firm. "Yes, ma'am. The secondary manager has had access since March. The account settings were modified in April." "I didn't authorize any changes in April," I said. There was a pause. "Would you like us to initiate a security reset?" "Yes," I whispered. After we ended the call, I sat in the kitchen chair for a long time, the light outside beginning to fade into amber. I remembered a morning years ago when David had watched me sorting old papers. I had tossed out a box of vacation plans, thinking it practical. He had said quietly, "Don't let others decide for you which memories are worth remembering." I logged back into the account, entered the password. Rejected. Tried again. Rejected. I don't remember changing it, because I never did. Nina didn't ask why I came to Lisbon alone, and so I told her everything, over a cup of tea. We sat on the narrow balcony that wrapped around her corner apartment. The stone tiles were warm underfoot, and the iron railings cast curling shadows onto the mosaic floor. Below, the old city stirred in its usual rhythm, slow guitars, seagulls, and the occasional clang of dishes being stacked in a cafe kitchen. She handed me a chipped ceramic cup, steam rising from its lip. "Mint tea," she said. "This smell helped me wake up after I fainted in court." I raised an eyebrow. She laughed. "That's a story for another day." The tea was strong, sharp in the nose, soft in the mouth. It reminded me of school field trips to botanical gardens of the sun through classroom windows. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't press. Then I began. Daniel started managing my appointments when Frank passed. At first it was helpful, driving me to the doctor, reminding me of birthdays. But then it became direction. Nina listened, no interruptions. I went on. "For the last 10 years, he's been organizing my calendar, handling my utilities, even choosing what apps go on my phone. When I asked questions, he'd smile and say, 'Don't worry, Mum, I've got it all handled.' And I believed him." Her gaze didn't shift. "My daughter tried to file for supervision over my finances when I was 67, she said, "because I forgot to pay a cable bill. That's ridiculous." She framed it as love. She said, "We just want to keep you safe." Nina took a sip. "It's how they do it now. Not with force, with forms." We both fell quiet. After a while, I said, "Sometimes I feel like women after 70 become invisible. Not even people, just roles. Caretaker, grandmother. Burden," Nina offered. "Exactly." The guitars from below strummed a minor chord, drifting up like a thought half remembered. Then something broke. I didn't plan to cry. It wasn't a grand sob, just a slow leak, one that had been waiting for a quiet room and a woman who didn't need explanations. Nina didn't flinch. She passed me a single tissue. No fuss. "Crying in front of someone who knows how to keep quiet," she said, "is a form of courage." I breathed in, out. The tears slowed. We ate a soft breakfast, fruit-toasted bread cheese, and for the first time since leaving Seattle, I didn't feel like I had to shrink myself to fit into someone else's plan. Later that afternoon, our landlady passed by while sweeping the stairs and said something in Portuguese I couldn't catch. Nina translated loosely. "She thinks we're two American grandmothers writing memoirs." "Maybe we are," I said. Back in my apartment, the light had shifted. I opened my laptop for no particular reason, but something pulled at me. A search bar. I typed Washington State guardianship laws. Scroll. Click. Legal phrases began to fill the screen. Limited guardianship. Medical capacity. Third-party designation. I had never noticed how quietly rights could be reassigned. I bookmarked several links and opened a blank document. If they have the right to say I'm weak, I also have the right to say I'm not done yet. That photo wasn't meant to include me. But there I was, blurred off to the side, unseen but present. It had been raining all afternoon in Lisbon, a Seattle kind of rain, not torrential, just persistent. I stayed inside, made tea, and folded the same scarf twice. It was a soft, forgettable day. Somewhere in the middle of cleaning the top drawer of the little writing desk, I found an envelope I didn't recognize. Not Portuguese. Postmarked from Seattle. My name written in Daniel's hand, his careful, slanted print. Inside, nothing. Just the empty shell of a message once intended. Beneath it, face down under a loose paperclip, was a small picture frame. The glass was cracked diagonally. I turned it over slowly. It was a family photo, taken in a hurry I remembered. The kind where someone props their phone on a stack of books and says, "Okay, smile," and then runs into the frame. It must have been a summer barbecue 2 years ago. Rachel's parents were visiting. Daniel had borrowed the neighbor's folding chairs. In the picture, Everyone looked neat and deliberate. Abby holding a lemonade, Rachel fixing her hair, Daniel mid-blink. And in the far left edge, just barely in the shot, was me. I wasn't smiling. I hadn't known the photo was being taken. I was walking toward them with a plate of grilled vegetables, the tongs still in my hand. That photo wasn't meant to include me, I murmured. But there I was, blurred off to the side, unseen, but present. The crack in the glass split through my forehead. It looked like a lightning bolt. I sat down the frame on my lap, letting the rain patter against the window. And then I remembered, after Frank passed, no one really took photos of me anymore. Or if they did, I wasn't in the center. I was background, supporting cast, except Abby. Once, when I was about to go back into the kitchen during a birthday party, she called Grandma wait and waved me into the photo. I blinked, looked again at the frame. There was something taped behind the cardboard backing. I peeled it away gently. A folded document, creased, yellowed at the edges. Power of attorney for emergency medical care. I stared at the signature. My own, unmistakably. The date 1 week after my brief hospital stay last year, when I fainted from dehydration after missing lunch and the flu hit me harder than expected. Daniel had handled everything that week. I remembered Rachel bringing a smoothie. I remembered the nurse asking, "Has someone talked to you about guardianship?" But I didn't remember this. I didn't remember signing anything. There was no expiration date on the form. I stood up, heart thudding. It wasn't panic. It was something colder. The phone rang. I startled. The sound felt foreign in this apartment. I picked it up. Grandma Abby's voice was soft, half whispering. "Hi. Sorry, I forgot the time difference. Are you okay?" "Yes, sweetheart. I'm okay." A pause. "I found your cookbook," she said. "The one with the cranberry muffins. I wanted to try the recipe." I smiled, despite myself. "They'll come out too dry if you skip the orange zest." "I won't," she promised. "And then casually, Dad said you might move into assisted living next year." "But I thought you hated those places." I froze. She added quickly, "I didn't mean anything. Just, he talks about it sometimes, like it's already decided." I swallowed. "Thank you for calling, Abby." When the call ended, I sat back down. I unfolded the power of attorney again, ran my fingers across the line where my name sat next to Daniel's. No expiration. No second signature. No witness. I looked back at the photo. There I was. Cropped, cracked, incidental. And I wondered how many other things had I signed without reading them, and what would happen if I started reading them all again. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But those words, they came out of the vent like cold wind knives. Evenings in Lisbon had a strange stillness to them, the kind that magnified every sound spoon's tapping against ceramic footsteps 2 floors above the click of your own breath. I wasn't doing anything important. Just wiping down the kitchen counter in the little flat, straightening a bowl of overripe fruit. A tea bag steeped nearby steam, unfurling toward the ceiling like a whisper trying to find someone to talk to. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint, hollow, echoing down the old ventilation shaft that cut between apartments. I assumed at first it was a neighbor's television or the usual bursts of late-night soccer commentary. But then the words became clearer. "She probably won't remember. You just need the doctor to document it properly this time." I froze. There was a pause, then another voice, lower, more precise. "Male. I've already scheduled the review. We'll file for permanent power of attorney after that. If we angle the conversation around safety and memory slips, no one will push back." Silence now in my kitchen, in my chest. I wasn't supposed to hear this. I wasn't even sure if it was real. but the words didn't float like television noise. They dropped heavy, like truth being lowered down in pieces. I stepped toward the vent in the wall, unsure what I was doing. The metal grill was cool to the touch, humming ever so slightly. "Don't say guardianship outright," the male voice continued. "Frame it as compassionate oversight. Make it sound like we're doing her a favor." My tea had gone cold. My knees buckled slightly and I leaned against the counter. I couldn't see their faces. I didn't even know whose apartment this voice was echoing from. But the names were unmistakable. Daniel. And Jenna, the new paralegal I hadn't met, but had seen CC'd on his emails. I walked slowly to the bedroom, my breath shallow. In the drawer beneath the winter scarves and expired passports, I had tucked my medical records just in case I ever needed to reference the dates of prescriptions or the pneumonia hospitalization 2 winters ago. I pulled them out, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the manila folder. There it was. Intake notes, a list of medications, a discharge summary. But something else had been slipped in. A typed memo from a neurologist I had never met. Subject: demonstrates mild cognitive disorganization. Family reports forgetfulness, concerns over hygiene and nutritional balance. Recommend evaluation for cognitive support measures. The memo was dated 3 weeks before I left Seattle. My hands trembled, but I read it again. Family reports, not patient complaints, not symptoms I had ever voiced. I had gone to the doctor for a bronchial infection, but the form suggested something deeper, as if a seed had been planted before I even walked through the door. They were building a file. I pressed the pages flat. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even shred the paper, though I wanted to. I just sat there and whispered aloud to the empty room, "I'm not a lawyer, but I was a teacher, and I know when someone is rewriting my role without asking. I used to be Helen Margaret Rhodes. They just call me Mom. But the name still works, on paper." I left the house with a canvas bag and told Nina I was going for a walk, just a little air before the sun got too warm. She didn't ask. She only nodded the kind of nod one woman gives another when silence is a shield, not a secret. I didn't turn toward the park. Instead, I made my way to the public library, tucked between 2 pastel buildings on Rua das Janelas Verdes. A man was sweeping the steps. A child ran past, with an ice cream already melting down his hand. Inside it was cool and clean, with long wooden tables and tall, arched windows. The hum of ceiling fans mixed with the sound of fingers tapping gently on laptop keys. I took a computer in the far corner, facing a mural of explorers at sea. The login screen blinked at me like a challenge. I typed Washington State Guardianship Laws. The results flooded in court procedures: eligibility, voluntary consent, mental incapacity, durable power of attorney, and a term that turned my stomach: full rights suspension. I clicked a link that explained the threshold: 2 medical opinions, 1 family petition, and a judge's signature that was all it took. I moved on to Helen Margaret Rhodes' Power of Attorney Seattle 2022. There was nothing, of course. No one had posted my legal erasure online. But then I typed medical forms Power of Attorney Template Washington. And there it was. The same format as the one I'd found in the manila envelope back in Seattle. 1 checkbox made all the difference: permanent without review, unless contested. It was printed at the bottom, barely visible a footnote in light grey. I sat back. My reflection on the screen, faint soft, looked older than I remembered. I used to teach kids how to find the main idea in a story, how to read between the lines. But I had failed to do that with my own life. "Helen," a voice said gently. I turned. The librarian was standing beside me, holding a slim stack of printed pages. "You requested Washington legal guidelines last week, right? I saved these." I didn't remember asking, but I nodded. Let me know if you need help printing anything she said before walking away. On a whim, I opened my email. Buried in the archives in an old folder labeled Frank's Contacts was a name I hadn't seen in years, Bernard Katz, attorney at law. Frank and Bernard had worked on a zoning case together back when we were still hosting 4th of July barbecues. I remembered Bernard as quiet, always wearing linen suits, and the only man at the party who brought ginger ale instead of wine. I clicked his email. It was still active. I typed nothing at first, just sat staring at the blinking cursor. Then I wrote, urgent. Helen Margaret Rhodes, requesting appointment. Regarding power of attorney, signed in 2022. I attached no details. I didn't want to say too much in writing, but I left my Portuguese number. 20 minutes later, while walking down the alley past a shuttered florist, my phone buzzed. Ms. Rhodes, a voice asked. Deep, measured. Yes. This is Bernard Katz. I recognize the name. Frank used to speak highly of you. I said nothing. I'm calling about your message, he continued. Just to be clear, if someone filed a durable permanent power of attorney without your knowledge or full mental clarity at the time and without neutral witnesses, you could sue. But you must act swiftly. Cases like this, they get buried fast. The air around me thickened. The street smelled of iron and hot stone. My bag suddenly felt too heavy. I understand I said my voice barely more than breath. Can you send me any documents you found? I will. I replied. Tomorrow. We hung up. At the next corner, I stopped and sat on a low wall. A thin cat curled beneath a bush. A woman sang softly on a balcony 2 floors above. I opened my bag and pulled out the form I'd printed. At the bottom, in faded blue ink, was my signature. Shaky, but still mine. I looked down at my hand. The skin was wrinkled, the veins were visible, but I still had fingerprints. And this signature, it's mine. Can I ask you something? Daniel, I said, still looking at my cold tea. The spoon trembled slightly in my hand. I wasn't stirring anything, just circling the inside of the cup, as if warming the edges could bring back something long gone. Daniel didn't look up from his phone. His right hand moved with quick familiarity, thumb flicking through emails, while his left hand tapped against the countertop. Sure, Mom, he said, his voice even. What's on your mind? Outside the maple tree in the yard had begun its annual transformation. One leaf landed against the window pane and stuck pressed flat like a thought I couldn't name. I was just wondering. I paused, letting the silence settle. That paper you had me sign last year, the one when I was still recovering from the fall, was that the same one that changed the guardianship arrangement? He stopped tapping. His fingers curled ever so slightly. That was just a precaution, he said. We've talked about this. No, I said, still gently. You talked. I nodded. He sighed the way he used to when Abby asked too many questions about how the world worked. Mum, I really don't think you need to worry about these things. That's why we took care of it. I smiled faintly. Took care of it. He poured himself another cup of coffee more to end the moment than to drink it. Let's not complicate things. You've got so much to enjoy right now. Lisbon sounds beautiful this time of year. Just relax, okay? Was I supposed to be at the meeting with the lawyer? I asked. He blinked. That was the only tell. A half-second delay. It wasn't necessary, he said, putting down the coffee pot. You were still recovering. We made decisions based on what was best at the time. I see. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was practiced. A gap they had grown used to filling for me, a silence they mistook for agreement. He returned to his phone. I reached for a notepad tucked behind the flour tin and quietly wrote, Meeting with lawyer. Not necessary. Signed during recovery. No direct discussion. Lisbon distraction. I tucked the page under the napkin holder. Later that afternoon, when Daniel left to pick up a package, I wandered into the living room. The light had shifted. A golden haze draped itself across the hardwood floor. On the desk was a folder. It wasn't locked. It wasn't hidden. I opened it. Inside were printed emails between Daniel and Jenna. They were clipped together, as if waiting for review. I read the top one. We'll need her signature before Katz gets more involved. If she changes her mind, it complicates everything. I'll make sure she's reassured by then or distracted. A quiet chill crawled up my arms. Behind it was a document freshly printed, unsigned. Request for permanent guardianship transfer recipient, Daniel Rhodes. The name was underlined 3 times, as if someone wanted it to stay clear, even in a blur of confusion. I placed the papers back exactly as I found them. Closed the folder slowly, steadily. In the kitchen, my tea still sat there. Cold. If I told you that your son intended to take over the entire estate within 3 weeks, what would you do? The question was neither sharp nor cruel. It hung in the air, neutral, like a cloud too heavy to float, too kind to rain. I sat back in the faded armchair across from Bernard Katz, fingers curled around the edge of my ash-coloured coat. My spine was stiff with restraint. I didn't answer right away. The room smelled of old books and lemon oil, one of the shelves tilted ever so slightly, sagging with age. Behind Bernard, a certificate of practice from 1981 had curled edges. It felt less like an office and more like a man's second living room, worn familiar, still intact. Bernard waited. He was good at waiting. No, I said at last. I haven't signed anything like that. At least, not knowingly. He tilted his head, one brow raised. Are you sure? I opened my purse slowly and pulled out the papers I had folded too many times, the printout from Daniel's desk, the copy of the unsigned transfer. A post-it note with a list of dates and odd phrases I'd remembered. Does this count as evidence? I asked. He didn't take the papers. Instead, he motioned gently toward the side table. May I? I nodded. He reached over, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. His lips moved slightly, not quite forming the words, but tasting them. When he was done, he sighed. I wish I could say this was unusual, he murmured, but I've seen this kind of orchestration before. He looked up. Helen, do you remember signing anything shortly after your hospital stay last year? Perhaps during discharge or immediately after? Yes. I was tired. I remember thinking, it's standard. And Daniel said not to worry. Bernard nodded, almost sadly. That's often when they do it. I looked at the ring on my finger, plain gold, worn smooth. David had given it to me when we had nothing but a rented trailer and a dream of a classroom with windows. He's trying to file for full guardianship, Bernard said. Not temporary. Full. Which means legal authority over your finances, medical decisions, and if he succeeds, your place of residence. I looked at the tea he'd offered earlier. It had gone cold, untouched. Can he do that without me knowing? He can try. Especially if the initial paperwork had fine print or lacked proper witness signatures. It's shaky, but in court many don't contest because they're afraid or ashamed. I stayed quiet. Bernard leaned forward. Helen, I must ask, are you here because you want to understand what he's doing, or because you want to stop it? I swallowed once. I want to choose, I said. Even if that choice doesn't change anything, I want it to be mine. He leaned back, eyes thoughtful. That he said is enough. From the bottom drawer of his desk, he pulled out a brown file. It made a soft sound like the hush of a curtain falling. This, he said, placing it between us, is the right to file an adverse guardianship motion. It doesn't accuse anyone, not yet. It simply says, I'm still here. And I get a say. The files tab read, H.M. Rhodes, preliminary objection. I didn't reach for it, not yet. But I watched my name, my full name, resting above the paperclip, unblurred, centered. Outside, the clouds pressed low over the city as if listening in. Do you remember, Mom? Daniel asked. I looked into his eyes. Calm, cool, expectant. And for the first time, I said, no, but I remember what you forgot. The living room was half lit by the dim lamp near the window. Outside, the light drizzle traced silver veins down the glass. The fireplace was on, but the warmth didn't reach far, just enough to flicker against the worn wood and soften the corners of our silhouettes. Daniel had offered tea earlier, as if it were a peace gesture. It arrived in Abby's hands, shy, brief, wordless, and vanished just as quickly. The teacups sat untouched. Between us, the silence had begun to stretch too long to ignore. You've seemed tired lately, Daniel said. Maybe it's time to talk about the long term. You know, care consistency? I took a breath, then slowly asked, do you remember the summer camp when you were 10? He frowned, almost annoyed by the change in subject. Which camp? The one near Rainier, where you climbed the big tree on the second day. Do you remember what happened? He squinted, uncomfortable. Vaguely. You were stuck, I said, on a thin branch too far out. A girl had dared you. You didn't want to back down. He looked away. I wasn't supposed to be there that day, I continued. But I came early. And when I saw you frozen, I climbed up. I tore my wrist on the bark when I pulled you back. The rain outside thickened soft percussion against the roof. They called your father. David arrived an hour later. He was furious. Not at you, but at me. I paused. He asked me in front of the principal, Helen, did you even remember the safety protocols? And I told him, if I don't remember, who will protect him? Daniel didn't move. His jaw was still. I used to believe that memory was something that kept the weak safe, I said. That by remembering, I was holding the walls up for others. He looked at me, arms crossed. What does that have to do with anything? I smiled faintly. You ask if I remember things, Daniel. With that same tone the doctors use when they're not sure if I'm still competent. Silence. But I see now you're not asking because I forget. You're asking because you want me to. And you've been building that into every paper, every appointment, every whispered meeting I wasn't invited to. He stood up sharply. I think you need to rest. Long term. My voice was soft, steady. I have just begun to wake up. He didn't reply. He walked toward the hallway, his shoulders taut, his back too straight. I reached for the teacup. It had cooled, but the warmth lingered on the porcelain. Memory too fades, but it never disappears. Not when it's mine. Helen is stunned when she finds an old envelope hidden in her sweater drawer. The recipient address is herself. The drawer gave a quiet creak when she opened it. The ashwood always stuck on one side, and for years she'd assumed there was nothing behind the rolled scarves and 2 folded cardigans. But today, she pulled harder. It was cold in the bedroom. The afternoon light from the shutters came in pale and grey, slicing across the carpet like tired footsteps. The heater clicked, but didn't hum, another thing Daniel had promised to fix, but never did. Her hand brushed the corner of something dry. A paper. No, an envelope. Aged brown, slightly curled, the ink smudged from time. The name on the front made her pause. To Helen Margaret Rhodes. Her own name. Written in Frank's handwriting. Her late husband's loops and uneven pressure. She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, the envelope resting in her lap like a confession. Inside was a letter stained in one corner. She unfolded it gently. The smell of paper and old ink greeted her like a ghost. Helen, if you find this, I'm gone. Not dramatic, just factual. I was afraid to talk about this while I was alive, partly out of guilt, partly out of not wanting to make things worse. But now I think you deserve to know. Daniel and I argued about you last winter. He kept saying you needed rest, that you weren't thinking clearly. I told him to back off. But I saw something in his eyes I didn't like. He asked me quietly if I'd be willing to talk to a doctor on your behalf, to make things easier. I didn't. But I also didn't tell you. If I go suddenly, and you find yourself facing papers that don't look familiar, don't assume they were made in love. Not everything our children do is out of kindness. You always trusted too much. Love. Frank Helen stared at the last line, her breath shallow. She hadn't cried for Frank in a long time. But this wasn't grief, it was the ache of a late warning. She remembered suddenly a Sunday morning a year ago. Frank and Daniel had been in the kitchen, voices low but sharp. She'd stepped out to the porch, pretending not to hear. She told herself then, peace is better than confrontation. But now, she wasn't sure. She looked back at the letter. Something scribbled at the bottom. Different ink, as if added later. Bank code RH7311LD. The key is in the old Bible. She blinked. That Bible had sat on the top shelf of the hallway bookcase for years. She hadn't opened it since Frank's funeral. It was one of those gifts from his sister, too ornate to use. She folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands. The paper trembled slightly, not from the wind, not from weakness, but from something else. Awakening. Frank hadn't told her everything, but he had told her enough to start turning the pages she'd left closed for too long. Helen flips through the pages of the wedding Bible, her heart pounding as she discovers the hidden slot for a security card. The Bible was heavier than she remembered. Thick, with gold-edged pages, and a red ribbon bookmark faded to rust. Helen carried it down from the hallway shelf, like a fragile heirloom, wiping off a film of dust with the edge of her cardigan sleeve. She had almost forgotten it existed a wedding gift from Frank's sister barely touched since their silver anniversary. It had sat in the same place for over a decade, unread, but respected like a shrine no one knew how to pray at anymore. Sitting at the dining table, the morning light across her lap, she opened it. The pages cracked slightly as she turned them one after another. Psalms, Proverbs, familiar lines she had memorized in Sunday school but no longer quoted. Then, somewhere between Ecclesiastes and Isaiah, she noticed it. The paper was uneven, a thickness in the spine. She turned the Bible carefully, and there it was, a thin slot, expertly cut into the binding tucked behind a ribbon lining. Inside a small plastic envelope. She drew it out. A card. RH7311LD. And beneath that, a folded sheet of fine notepaper. Frank's handwriting again. No message this time. Just numbers. A branch code. A bank name she hadn't thought of in years. Rainier Trust Bank Queen Anne Branch. By 11 a.m., Helen was standing in line at the modest building that used to be a full-service bank, but had since become a hybrid of ATM kiosks and one remaining desk for legacy accounts. The carpet smelled like worn-out air freshener and history. The clerk was young, polite, but uncertain what to make of her request. Helen handed over the code and card without a word. He clicked through the system, paused, then frowned. This account was last accessed 9 years ago, he said slowly. But it's still active. There's no cosigner listed. Only you. Helen's pulse flickered, and the balance. He hesitated, then turned the monitor slightly so she could see. Her eyes widened, not because it was enormous, but because it was enough. Enough to live alone, to seek counsel, to say no without asking permission. Frank had set it aside, quietly, while she was still packing school lunches and forgetting to buy socks for Daniel. There's also a note the clerk added, handing her a printed sheet. It says the beneficiary was never to be altered without a notarized change from the original holder. That holder was Frank Rhodes. Helen took the printout and folded it into an envelope she brought from home. She wrote the date in the upper corner, just like she had when submitting lesson plans. Old habits, the quiet kinds, didn't vanish. Outside, she sat on a bench and looked up at the November sky. Pale, washed out, just like Seattle always was this time of year. But something inside her felt warmer. This Daniel didn't know about. She had a door now, a way out that didn't involve confrontation, at least not yet. A foundation no one could shake with paperwork and polite deception. She took out her phone, scrolled to Bernard Katz's name, and pressed call. When his familiar, measured voice answered, she said only, "I need you to read something to me. Mrs. Harper. I never believed Frank would keep that secret from you." The office was exactly as Helen remembered it from a decade ago, tucked between a florist and an insurance agency, its brass doorknob worn smooth by time. The sign on the frosted glass hadn't changed. Katz and Associates, Elder and Estate Law. There was something comforting about the smell of old paper and lemon polish. Helen sat across from Bernard Katz, placing 2 envelopes on the table between them. One held the bank printout, the other Frank's letter. Bernard took his glasses off the rim of his nose, put them back on, and opened the letter first. His eyes scanned slowly, lips tight. Then he looked up, gentler than before. "I knew your husband was cautious," he said. "But this—" He tapped the paper. "He never mentioned this account. And I worked with him for 15 years. Helen said nothing. Her fingers curled around the teacup the receptionist had brought in. The warmth didn't quite reach her knuckles. "This," Bernard continued, holding up the bank statement, "is your account, set up solely in your name. Frank had every legal right to do this, and you have every legal right to access it without Daniel's knowledge, involvement, or permission." A pause. "But I have to ask, is this about the money or something else?" Helen leaned back, her spine straight. Daniel changed. Or maybe... I stopped looking closely. First it was the phone calls that became shorter. Then the mail started coming opened. He sold the Tacoma house without telling me, said it was too much for me to handle. "And the guardianship?" Bernard asked gently. "I signed something after I was discharged last year. I was weak, groggy. I remember Daniel saying it was just a precaution for emergencies." Bernard opened a drawer and pulled out a slim folder marked Rhodes Helen M. He flipped through a few pages until he came to the guardianship document, a familiar sheet, now freshly suspicious. He frowned. "There's no date on this signature page," he muttered. And here he pointed. The witness lines are signed but out of order. Whoever filed this was sloppy, or in a hurry. He looked at Helen, eyes sharp behind the lenses. "This is enough to raise a motion. If you want, we can file for review, possibly reverse the guardianship." Helen exhaled, quiet but steady. "I don't want a war, Bernard. I want a voice. I want to be able to decide if I'm tired or not be told I'm fragile just because I have wrinkles." Bernard nodded slowly. "Then we start here." He pulled a blank legal form from his drawer and slid it in front of her. "This is your petition to re-examine guardianship status. Once you sign this, we begin the process." Helen took the pen, but paused. She looked out the office window. It was grey today, typical Seattle, but she no longer felt clouded inside. Not today. She met Bernard's gaze. I want to have my say back. Not because I'm old, but because I still have enough memory to see how I was treated. She signed. Are you sure you want to represent yourself? The court clerk tilted his head, his eyes a mixture of politeness and doubt. Helen Margaret Rhodes stood tall beneath the flickering fluorescent lights of the civil courthouse in downtown Seattle. She wore her ash-gray coat, buttoned high at the collar. One gloved hand rested on the smooth surface of the filing counter. The other clutched the envelope bearing her petition. The hallway buzzed with soft movement, the muted thrum of typing from an open office door, the quiet rustle of papers. Far off, someone cleared their throat, and a gavel rang out in a courtroom 3 doors down. November had come in like fog, heavy grey, dense with unspoken things. I'm sure, Helen answered. Her voice, though not loud, did not waver. 2 days later, she returned to the same building for the preliminary hearing. A bench against the far wall creaked beneath her as she sat waiting. She watched Daniel pace in a straight-line phone in hand, brow furrowed. He hadn't yet seen her. When their eyes finally met, there was a flicker, something between surprise and discomfort on his face. He said nothing. Abby followed a step behind him. 16, now taller than Helen remembered. The girl's gaze was different from her father's, not cold, not confused. Just alert, watchful. In courtroom 2B, the clerk called the case number. Helen rose. Daniel sat flanked by his attorney. Helen stood alone, papers in hand. The judge, a middle-aged woman with dark-rimmed glasses, looked at Helen carefully before beginning. This hearing is to review the guardianship status of Ms. Helen Margaret Rhodes. We are here to determine whether the current arrangement shall remain in place or be reassessed. Helen stepped forward. Your Honour, I am requesting a temporary suspension of Mr. Daniel Rhodes's guardianship. I believe the original petition was filed under circumstances that lacked full consent and clarity. The judge nodded. Proceed. Helen laid out her evidence slowly, not like a lawyer, but like a teacher. She submitted copies of the unsigned and undated guardianship document. She recounted the overheard conversation through the vent. She described the financial irregularities, the account she never authorized the medical files moved without her knowledge. At one point, Rose, her old neighbor, stood from the back row and affirmed, "She called me after hearing something strange. I told her to write everything down." And she did. Daniel shifted in his seat. His attorney looked less sure now. Then a quiet movement near the front. Bernard Katz rose not from the legal tables, but from the public benches. Your Honour, he said, voice measured, may I address the court briefly? Not as a legal representative, but as a concerned citizen with long-standing acquaintance to the petitioner. The judge tilted her head. You may. Bernard turned to the courtroom. If a woman can organize a trip across 4 countries, preserve digital and written records, and seek clarification of her rights without agitation or confusion, is she truly incapable of managing her own affairs? Silence. Even Daniel didn't breathe. The judge reviewed her notes. Her pen moved slowly. Then she spoke. This court will issue a temporary suspension of guardianship effective immediately. An independent evaluation of Ms. Rhodes's legal and medical capacity will be scheduled within the next 30 days. Until then, no irreversible decisions or property transfers may occur. Helen lowered her eyes, not in defeat, but in calm acknowledgement. Outside, the sky had cleared. The grey light had given way to a pale sun. Helen stepped down the courthouse steps, her shoulders straight beneath her coat. From her pocket, she withdrew a folded piece of paper, a note written in confident script, I will testify if necessary. Chloe. She folded it again. The paper crackled softly like the sound of the old cedar trees in her backyard, the ones still standing. "I'll make 2 cups of tea. One for me. One for the last words you didn't say." The keys still turned in the lock, even though the apartment hadn't been hers in years. A musty scent met Helen as she stepped inside, dust, old varnish, something floral still clinging faintly to the curtains. The place was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she was simply older, more expansive now in thought than she'd once allowed herself to be. She didn't take off her coat. Instead, she walked straight to the narrow kitchen where everything had once begun. The oval table stood unmoved in its corner. One of its legs still wobbled. The small brass kettle sat beside the stove untouched, like it had been waiting. Helen opened the cupboard above the sink. Inside, an old tin of Earl Grey tea, faded but sealed. Her fingers brushed the edge, and it rattled softly in her grip. She smiled faintly. The tea had outlasted conversations, years perhaps, even the memory of why it was there. She set 2 cups on the table, one blue-rimmed, the other cracked slightly near the handle, 2 spoons, 2 napkins, folded in triangles. The steam rose quietly as the kettle whistled, echoing faintly in the still room. Opposite her, the other chair remained empty. She poured. A flash of a memory came soft as the clink of ceramic Frank, once seated across from her, had said with a smile too tired to be warm, "If you keep quiet, I will learn to forget my mother's voice." Back then, she had looked away. She had been afraid to ask what he meant. Today, she answered it in silence. She reached for her pen. From her coat pocket, she drew a sheet of pale stationery. Her handwriting was slow, steady. "Dear Abby, I have no sides for you to pick, no battles to win in my name. But if one day you are forced to choose between comfort and truth, choose what lets you keep your head high. Love isn't silence. It's the courage to speak, even gently. Always your grandmother, Helen Margaret Rhodes." She folded the note and slipped it into an envelope, left it beside the second teacup. Then came the soft, sudden chime of the doorbell. Helen rose and walked to the door, heart holding steady in her chest. When she opened it, Abby stood there, hood-down cheeks, pink with drizzle, a small box in hand. Her eyes were watery, but clear. "I didn't tell Dad," she whispered. I missed you." Helen stepped aside without a word. Abby entered the box, now held close to her chest. "I brought something," she said, lifting the lid. Inside, a small almond cake, dusted with powdered sugar. From her coat pocket, Abby drew something else, a small, gold-toned hair clip. "I found it in Mum's drawer. You used to wear this." Helen's breath caught. The clip was nothing remarkable, but she remembered the weight of it, the way it used to hold her hair when she taught the morning class. "I kept it," Abby said, eyes down, "to remember how decisive you were." Helen smiled, not with triumph, but with the soft gravity of having returned to herself. She gestured toward the table. "Would you like some tea with me?" Abby nodded. Outside, the rain tapered off, whispering its final rhythm against the shutters. As 2 generations sat quietly, the past between them steeped, poured, no longer silenced. They asked if I wanted to join their Sunday brunch. For the first time, I hesitated. The house had been cleaned perhaps too thoroughly. The framed photo of Lisbon now stood by the windowsill, slightly tilted its edges, catching the early sun. Helen sipped her tea, slowly, the warmth circling her fingers, the scent of bergamot lifting through the quiet. On the table before her lay the letter she'd written, but never sealed. It was addressed simply to Abby, "Whenever you're ready." The envelope remained open, its flap resting like a breath, paused. Her fingers brushed the edge of a yellow scarf, folded neatly nearby. She had worn it that day on the balcony in Alfama, watching the river move like time made liquid. Abby had drawn it, the folds, the lean of her posture, even the look in her eyes. That sketch now sat beside her cup, newly delivered, bound inside a sketchbook, with a ribbon that had once belonged to Helen's sewing drawer. She turned to the other envelope, Rose's letter from Maine. It had arrived 3 days ago, in thick paper with slanted handwriting. Don't go back to being tolerated. Rose had written, go forward to being seen. Helen reread that line 3 times, folded the letter, unfolded it again. Abby had arrived not long after. She had placed the sketchbook on the table, looking around the tidy room as if seeing it for the first time or the last. Dad said, well, he said you could come to brunch today, Abby murmured. He said, we missed you. Helen looked up. The air between them was light, not yet warm. Did he say he was wrong? She asked gently. Abby's eyes shifted. No, she said. He didn't say that. Helen nodded. She reached for the blank note card beside her and began to write. Not to Michael, not even to Abby, but to herself. Thank you for staying quiet long enough to hear your own voice again. When she finished, she closed the card, set her pen down, and smoothed her palms over the scarf. Then she looked at Abby. Will you come? The girl asked softly. Helen looked at her steady and calm. Do you want me there, Abby? Or do they? Abby didn't answer, but her eyes shimmered, uncertain, honest. Helen smiled. She picked up the yellow scarf, draped it over her shoulders like a breeze made visible, then stood. She didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, she left it, resting under a small stone by the window, facing east, where the light had always entered first. No invitation needed, no permission asked, just presence and choice. She left the envelope unsealed, resting under a stone by the window for the wind to decide. I didn't knock. I walked in like I belonged, because this time I did. The house smelled of lemon and clean linen. The cushions on the couch had been fluffed, the kettle whistled softly in the background, and the light from the west-facing window touched the walls gently where new photos hung in plain frames. One showed Helen and Abby, standing beneath the arches of the Alhambra in Granada, their hands linked their backs to the camera. Another was of Helen alone, her face tilted toward the sky, eyes closed, a scarf brushing her jaw like sunlight-made fabric. She had set the table with care. Not formality, just intention. Sliced pears, almond biscuits, loose tea, steeping in a clear pot. The notebook sat at the center of the table, closed with a fountain pen beside it. Helen adjusted her collar and glanced at the clock. When the knock came, she did not rise too quickly. She opened the door with her usual calm and stepped aside. Michael entered first, holding a pie she knew he had not baked. Jenna followed, tight-lipped, but not cold. Abby came last, her presence like breath. No one sat until Helen did. I thought we'd each write one sentence, she said, gesturing to the notebook. Something we choose to carry forward. Michael's brow furrowed, unsure if it was a trap. Helen only smiled and poured the tea. The afternoon unfolded slowly. The room held no tension, only space. When Jenna reached for the pen, she paused, then wrote without asking permission. That was new. Michael cleared his throat. I found this, he said, producing the notebook Helen had once forgotten on a bench at the courthouse. He slid it toward her. I thought, maybe you left it for someone else. I didn't, Helen said, her voice like brushed velvet, but it found who it needed to. Jenna looked down at her cup. Then softly, we didn't know how much space we took. Until you stepped out. Helen nodded. She didn't add to the statement, didn't press the moment. Abby reached for the notebook next. She read her sentence aloud as she finished it. I inherit your courage, not your silence. The room stilled. Even the kettle had stopped its murmuring. Helen Rose reached for her scarf, the yellow one, and folded it neatly. She placed it on the table beside the teapot. "It's not that I stopped aging," she said. "It's that I stopped waiting. No applause, no protest. Just a shift, felt rather than seen." Later, when they left, Michael turned back at the door. Jenna, too, glanced once more. Helen didn't wave. When they left, they looked back. I didn't need them to, but it was nice. She was no longer the woman in the blurred corner of the frame. With quiet defiance and undeniable clarity, she stepped back into focus, not to reclaim the past, but to redefine the present. Justice may come with wrinkles and silence, but when it arrives, it leaves no room for doubt. Sometimes it only takes one uninvited voice to unwrite a script written without consent. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story.